The spaceport's promenade bustled with life, an unending stream of alien and human travelers weaving between stalls and vendors hawking wares from across the stars. Thomas adjusted his collar, glancing at the small tablet in his hand. His assignment was clear: establish a formal trade route between the Earth Federation and the Lurwan Consortium. But first, he needed to find his contact, and that meant navigating this sprawling mess of a station. Maybe if you looked up once in a while, you'd actually see where you're going. Thomas turned toward the voice. A tall man stood nearby, wearing a worn jacket that had seen better days and a belt crowded with tools and gadgets. He looked human, but his skin had a faint bluish tint, and the sharp glint of a cybernetic implant flickered in his left eye. "Excuse me?" Thomas asked, stepping closer. "You're the diplomat, aren't you? The one who was supposed to meet me here about an hour ago." The man crossed his arms, looking more amused than irritated. Thomas blinked. "Wait, you're—" He quickly checked his notes. "Graydon Vallis? The station liaison. That's me. Good to see you're finally paying attention. I was about to leave." Graydon turned and started walking, and Thomas scrambled to catch up. "Look, I got held up by security. They insisted on scanning everything twice." "Sounds about right," Graydon said over his shoulder. "Next time, show them you're with me." Cuts through the red tape. As they made their way through the crowded promenade, Thomas tried to size up his guide. Graydon seemed relaxed, even confident, but there was an edge to him. He moved through the crowds with practiced ease, as if he knew exactly when to step aside to avoid a collision or how to skirt a particularly dense group. Thomas had spent years navigating diplomatic circles on Earth, but this was something else entirely. "Are you used to this place?" Thomas asked. "Been here for a few years now," Graydon replied. "It's not bad once you get a feel for it. Besides, there's no better place to meet people from just about everywhere." "Everywhere, huh?" Thomas looked around at the array of species and cultures on display. "It's impressive. You'll get used to it. But if you're here for business, you'd better get your head in the game. The Lurwans aren't known for their patience." "I'm aware," Thomas said, holding up his tablet. "I've read the dossiers, reviewed the protocol. I'm ready." "Good. Because if you mess this up, you won't just be answering to them, you'll be answering to me." They continued down a long corridor that led away from the promenade. The crowds thinned, replaced by walls adorned with holographic panels displaying advertisements and station updates. Graydon stopped in front of a tall set of double doors. "This is where you'll meet them," Graydon said, gesturing toward the doors. "Don't expect them to roll out a welcome mat." Thomas hesitated. "Anything I should know before I walk in there? Just be honest. They can smell a lie a mile away. And don't be afraid to stand your ground. They respect that." "Got it," Thomas said, squaring his shoulders. Graydon gave him a nod. "I'll be out here if you need me." Thomas stepped through the doors and into a spacious meeting room. The Lurwan delegation was already seated, their high-backed chairs arranged in a semicircle around a sleek, glass-topped table. Their skin shimmered faintly under the room's artificial light, and their wide, unblinking eyes locked onto him the moment he entered. "Honored representatives of the Lurwan Consortium," Thomas began, bowing slightly. "I appreciate the opportunity to meet with you today. I hope we can discuss." "Your hope is irrelevant," interrupted one of the Lurwans, whose voice had a resonant, almost musical quality. "What matters is your proposal. Speak." Thomas paused, then adjusted his stance. "Of course, the Earth Federation proposes a mutual exchange of resources that would benefit both our peoples. Specifically, we're looking to establish a trade corridor that—" As he spoke, he noticed one of the Lurwans studying him intently. Their gaze was piercing, as if they were trying to see past his words to something deeper. It was unsettling, but Thomas pressed on. The discussion that followed was intense. Every point he made met with questions and challenges. Yet he held his ground, relying on both his training and the advice Graydon had given him. After what felt like hours, the Lurwans finally leaned back in their chairs. "We will consider your proposal," the lead representative said, though their expression remained unreadable. "You will have our decision in due course." Thomas nodded, thanked them, and left the room. Outside, Graydon was leaning against the wall, arms crossed. Well? Graydon asked. They'll consider it, Thomas said. That's something, Graydon replied. Most people don't even get that far. Guess you're not completely hopeless after all. Thomas laughed despite himself. Thanks, I think. Graydon grinned and clapped him on the shoulder. Come on, let's grab a drink. You've earned it. As they walked back toward the promenade, Thomas found himself feeling something unexpected. A small flicker of satisfaction. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, but for now, he was ready to take the next step. Chapter 2. The Forbidden Connection. Back at the station's central market, the corridors hummed with activity. Thomas and Graydon stood near a vendor selling luminous fruits encased in thin, shimmering shells. Graydon inspected one, holding it up to the light. You ever try one of these? No, Thomas said. What are they? Zerwell pods, Graydon replied. Sweet, tangy, a good pick-me-up. But, fair warning, too many, and you'll get a splitting headache. He tossed one to Thomas, who fumbled to catch it. Try it. Thomas turned the small pod over in his hand. How do you even eat this thing? Bite through the shell, spit out the rind, Graydon said. The juice inside's what you want. Thomas hesitated, then bit down. A burst of flavor filled his mouth, sharp, citrusy, with a hint of something floral. He quickly spat out the thin, papery rind. Not bad. Told you. Graydon grinned. Next time, don't doubt me. Thomas was about to respond when he spotted a familiar figure in the crowd. Lonnie moved through the market gracefully, her dark robes flowing like liquid shadow. She stopped at a nearby stall, her long, elegant fingers tracing a piece of iridescent jewelry. Who's that? Graydon asked, following Thomas's gaze. Lonnie, Thomas said quietly. She's one of the Lure-One delegates. I met her yesterday. Graydon raised an eyebrow. And? And nothing, Thomas said quickly. We talked briefly after the meeting, that's all. Graydon smirked. You've got that look? The I met someone interesting look. Thomas frowned. There's no look. There's definitely a look. I've been around enough stations to know it when I see it. Graydon clapped him on the shoulder. Let's go say hi. Before Thomas could protest, Graydon was already weaving through the crowd toward Lonnie. Thomas had no choice but to follow. Good morning, Graydon said as they approached. Enjoying the market? Lonnie turned, her expression neutral. It is adequate. The selection of goods here is varied. Her eyes flicked to Thomas. You. Thomas swallowed. Hello, Lonnie. Graydon glanced between them. You two already know each other. Small station, I guess. Lonnie regarded Graydon coolly. I don't believe we've met. Graydon Vallis, he said, extending a hand. Station liaison. I help make sure things run smoothly around here. Lonnie didn't take his hand, but she inclined her head slightly. Lonnie Sarova. Nice to meet you, Graydon said, dropping his hand. He looked over at Thomas. Well, I'll leave you two to catch up. I need to check on something anyway. With that, he disappeared into the crowd. Thomas shifted awkwardly. Sorry about him. He's blunt, Lonnie said, but not unpleasant. Thomas smiled faintly. That's one way to put it. Lonnie turned back to the jewelry stall, picking up the iridescent piece she'd been examining. This station is different from what I expected. How so? Thomas asked, stepping closer. Busier. More chaotic. Yet it functions. She set the jewelry down and looked at him. The people here, humans especially, seem adaptable. Thomas wasn't sure how to respond. Well, we try. Lonnie studied him for a moment. You seem different from the others. I'm not sure what you mean. Your approach. Your demeanor. Her tone was calm, but her words carried weight. You don't treat me as an obstacle. You speak as though I am someone worth hearing. Thomas was caught off guard. I guess I don't see why I shouldn't. You're clearly impressive. Her lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. That is not a word I often hear directed at me. They stood in silence for a moment, the noise of the market fading into the background. Thomas wasn't sure what to say next, but Lonnie spoke first. You're not afraid of me? No, Thomas said honestly. Should I be? Most who know who I am would say yes. Maybe I don't see the point in fear. You're just you. Her gaze softened, and for a brief moment, the careful mask she wore seemed to slip. That is an uncommon perspective. Thomas hesitated, then said, Look, if you ever want to talk, about anything not related to politics or trade agreements, let me know. Lonnie tilted her head, considering him. I will keep that in mind. Before he could say more, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the throng. Thomas remained there for a moment, wondering what exactly had just happened. Chapter 3: Whispers of Defiance. Thomas adjusted the lapel of his jacket, trying to ignore the weight of a dozen watchful eyes. Graydon, standing beside him, leaned in. "Relax," he muttered. "You're doing fine." "I'm not nervous," Thomas replied, though his clenched hands betrayed him. They were back in the negotiation chamber, facing the Lurwan delegation. Today's session wasn't going well. Every proposal Thomas made was countered with probing questions and thinly veiled skepticism. Lonnie sat at the far end of the table, silent, her expression unreadable. Since their encounter in the market, she'd said little to him, yet her presence filled the room. Occasionally, her gaze would flick toward him, her violet eyes locking onto his for a fleeting second before shifting away. "We will consider your revised terms," one of the Lurwans said finally, leaning back in their chair. "For now, this session is adjourned." As the delegation began to disperse, Thomas let out a slow breath. Graydon clapped him on the back. "Not bad. They didn't throw anything at you this time." "High praise," Thomas muttered. Graydon smirked. "Come on, I'll buy you a drink." They made their way to the station's main lounge. The place was crowded, a cacophony of voices mixing with the hum of alien music. Graydon ordered something from the bar, a glowing blue liquid that looked vaguely hazardous. "Here's to another day of not getting thrown out an airlock," Graydon said, raising his glass. Thomas chuckled. "I'll drink to that." As they sipped their drinks, Graydon leaned back in his chair. "You know, you've been spending a lot of time around Lonnie." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "You keeping tabs on me?" "More like keeping an eye out." "She's complicated." "I can handle complicated." Graydon snorted. "I'm sure you think you can. Just remember, she's tied up in some serious politics. Her people don't just marry for love, they marry for alliances, power, stability. She's not exactly free to do as she pleases." "I'm aware," Thomas said, his tone steady. Graydon studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "Suit yourself. Just don't say I didn't warn you." A few hours later, as the station's artificial lights dimmed to simulate night, Thomas found himself wandering the quieter corridors. He turned a corner and stopped short. There was Lonnie, standing alone by a large viewport. The stars framed her figure, making her seem almost otherworldly. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked. She turned, her expression softening slightly. "You appear restless." "Part of the job." He stepped closer, but not too close. "Mind if I join you?" Lonnie gestured to the space beside her. "Do as you wish." They stood in silence for a moment, gazing out at the endless expanse of stars. Finally, Lonnie spoke. "Your people have a way of complicating things." Thomas tilted his head. "I'll take that as a compliment." It wasn't intended as one. "Still," he said with a small smile, "I'll choose to hear it that way." Her lips twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "You are very strange, Thomas. And you're very fascinating, Lonnie." She turned to him fully, her gaze intense. "You speak to me as though I am not bound by duty, by obligation. Do you not realize what I am?" "I know exactly what you are," he said quietly. "And I think there's more to you than duty." For a moment, something in her expression cracked, just a glimpse of vulnerability. But then, just as quickly, her usual composure returned. "Good night, Thomas," she said, turning away. "Good night, Lonnie," he replied, watching as she walked off down the corridor. As he made his way back to his quarters, Thomas felt a strange mix of emotions. He couldn't quite explain why he felt drawn to her, but the connection was undeniable. And though he didn't fully understand what he was getting himself into, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't about to back down now. Chapter 4: Understanding Through Struggle. Thomas adjusted his earpiece as he followed Graydon into one of the sprawling docking bays on Lonnie's homeworld. The air smelled metallic, faintly acrid, with the subtle undercurrent of machinery and alien spices. Around them, cargo loaders trundled back and forth, their operators, both human and alien, barking orders and curses in an array of languages. Graydon pointed toward a cluster of towering storage containers. "They're supposed to be over there. The shipment was delayed again, and if we don't sort it out, the whole negotiation schedule's gonna fall apart." Thomas nodded, quickening his pace. His gaze swept the scene, taking in the organized chaos of a major trade hub in action. He spotted Lonnie near one of the loaders, speaking sharply to a technician. The tension in her body was unmistakable, her usually composed demeanor cracking just enough to reveal the strain she was under. "Lonnie," Thomas called as they approached. She turned, her expression shifting to something more guarded. "Thomas." "Graydon. I didn't expect to see you here." "We heard about the delays," Graydon said. "Thought we'd come down and see what we could do." "I appreciate the concern, but this is an internal matter. I have it under control." "Doesn't look that way," Thomas said. glancing at the stalled loaders and the growing crowd of frustrated workers. "What's the holdup?" Lonnie hesitated, then sighed. "The loading drone's guidance systems aren't syncing with the main network. They're stuck until we can reset the system, but the technicians are saying it could take hours." Graydon looked over at Thomas. "Think you can help?" Thomas nodded. "I've worked with similar systems before. Maybe I can at least figure out what's causing the delay." Lonnie gave him a skeptical look. "You're a diplomat, not a systems engineer. Diplomats learn a lot of things," he said with a small smile. "Let me take a look." She stepped aside, and Thomas approached the nearest console. He began scanning the data streams, searching for the error logs. Graydon leaned over his shoulder. "You sure you know what you're doing?" "Mostly," Thomas muttered. He tapped a few commands, his brow furrowing. "Looks like a simple misalignment in the update sequence. If I roll it back a step and then reapply the patch, it should reset the guidance links." "Sounds easy enough," Graydon said. "So do it." Thomas worked quickly, his fingers flying over the interface. After a few tense minutes, the console beeped, and the drones began to hum back to life. One by one, they rose and started moving, smoothly loading cargo into the waiting freighters. Lonnie watched the process unfold, her expression carefully neutral. "You were correct. The problem is resolved." Thomas straightened, wiping his hands on his jacket. "Just needed a fresh set of eyes." "Thank you," she said, her tone more formal than he'd expected. Graydon clapped him on the shoulder. "Nice work. Maybe you missed your calling as a tech wizard." Thomas chuckled. "I'll stick to diplomacy, thanks." Lonnie stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You didn't have to intervene." "I know," Thomas said, "but it seemed like the right thing to do." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I won't forget it." "Good," he said, his smile returning, "because I'm not planning on going anywhere." Her gaze lingered on him for just a moment longer before she turned and walked back toward the workers, issuing orders with renewed authority. Graydon leaned in, his voice low. "You really do like making things complicated, don't you?" Thomas shrugged. "Maybe, but sometimes complicated's worth it." Graydon shook his head, grinning. "You're something else, Thomas. Come on. Let's get out of here before someone asks us to fix something else." As they made their way back through the bustling bay, Thomas felt a faint sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just about fixing a technical glitch or smoothing over a delay. It was about proving, in a small but meaningful way, that he and Lonnie could find common ground. And for now, that was enough. Chapter 5, Touching Hearts. The stars outside the station's observation deck glimmered faintly, the vast expanse of space a quiet, unchanging backdrop. Thomas stood at the viewport, arms crossed, lost in thought. The deal with the Lurwan delegation still hung in the balance, and though progress had been made, he felt the weight of every concession, every carefully chosen word. "Enjoying the view?" Graydon's voice pulled him out of his reverie. Thomas turned. "It's quiet out here. Makes it easier to think." Graydon walked over, hands in his jacket pockets. "You're going to need a clear head. Word is the Lurwan delegation's growing restless. They expected results by now." "I know," Thomas said, sighing. "I just need more time." "Well, if you've got a plan, now's the time to share it. You're not in this alone." Thomas gave him a faint smile. "Thanks, Graydon. I'll let you know if I need backup." As Graydon nodded and left, Thomas turned back to the viewport. A soft voice spoke behind him. "It is late to be working." He turned and saw Lonnie standing a few paces away, her hands clasped in front of her. She was dressed more simply than usual, a dark, flowing garment that reflected the low light. "Couldn't sleep," Thomas said, gesturing to the stars. "Needed some fresh air." Lonnie arched a brow. "Air does not change here." He chuckled. "Figure of speech. But what about you? Shouldn't you be resting?" She hesitated, then stepped closer. "I found myself preoccupied. The talks have been difficult." "That's an understatement," Thomas said, leaning back against the railing. "Seems like every time we take a step forward, someone's pulling us back." "It is not uncommon. Agreements of this nature are often fraught with uncertainty." Thomas nodded, studying her face. "You don't seem as concerned about it." He point in arguing for the sake of arguing. "If we're going to find a solution, we might as well try to understand each other." She tilted her head slightly, her eyes searching his. "An unusual perspective." He shrugged. It's how I've always done things. It's not always easy, but sometimes it works. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, not awkward but charged, as if something unspoken lingered just beneath the surface. Finally, Lonnie stepped closer, her voice softer. "You are not what I expected, Thomas." "What did you expect?" he asked, his tone equally quiet. "Someone less sincere?" Her gaze held his. "It is unusual to find one so willing to listen, to care. I think you'd be surprised how many people are like that," he said. "Perhaps," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "But not in my experience." Thomas hesitated, then reached out, his fingers just barely brushing hers. It was a small, tentative gesture, but it carried a weight neither of them could ignore. Lonnie didn't pull away. Instead, she let her hand linger, her eyes never leaving his. "It's not always easy," Thomas said quietly. "Trying to bridge the gap between different worlds." "No, it is not," she agreed, her voice steady. "But sometimes it is worth the effort." He smiled faintly. "I'd like to think so." For a moment, they simply stood there, hands barely touching, the stars beyond them silent witnesses to something new and fragile. Neither spoke of what it meant, not yet. But in that shared moment, they both felt a shift, something that couldn't be undone. Chapter 6, Choices in the Dark. Thomas leaned on the railing of a shadowed walkway overlooking the station's lower levels. The artificial lighting down below flickered occasionally, casting a rhythmic pulse over the bustling activity below. He could hear the faint hum of machinery, the murmur of workers exchanging instructions, and the occasional clang of cargo containers being moved. Graydon joined him a few moments later, a steaming cup of something pungent in hand. He handed another cup to Thomas, who accepted it without a word. They stood in silence for a while, sipping the hot drink and watching the activity below. "You're thinking too much again," Graydon finally said, breaking the quiet. Thomas smirked. "And you're always so good at knowing what I'm thinking, huh?" Graydon chuckled. "You're not that hard to read. Something's on your mind. Care to share, or should I start guessing?" Thomas hesitated, then sighed. Lonnie's caught in the middle. This alliance, this marriage, she feels like it's her responsibility. Like she has no choice. "Welcome to galactic politics," Graydon replied. "That's how these things go. Someone's always the sacrificial lamb for the greater good." Thomas shook his head. "It's more than that. She's not just some pawn. She's smart, capable, and Graydon raised an eyebrow. "And?" Thomas hesitated again, running a hand through his hair. "And it's not fair to her. She deserves more than just being handed off like a bargaining chip." Graydon gave him a long look before sighing. "So what are you going to do about it?" "What can I do?" Thomas said, his voice tense. "If I speak out, I jeopardize everything. The trade deal, the peace negotiations, everything falls apart if I get too involved. But if you do nothing, she's stuck. You really think you can just walk away from that?" Graydon asked, his tone pointed. Thomas didn't answer right away. He stared down at the workers, their movements mechanical and efficient. Finally, he said, "I don't know. I don't know what's right here." Graydon patted him on the shoulder. "You're the diplomat, not me. But remember, there's more than one kind of battle. Sometimes the fight is just standing up for what's right." Before Thomas could reply, a familiar voice reached them. "You seem troubled." They both turned to see Lonnie approaching, her silhouette framed by the dim station lights. Graydon gave Thomas a quick glance, then stepped away. "I'll give you two some space," he said, and walked off into the shadows. Lonnie stepped closer, her gaze steady. "You have been distant." Thomas leaned back against the railing, trying to appear more casual than he felt. "Just thinking. A lot's at stake here." "Indeed," she said. "But you are not the only one who bears this burden." "I know," he said softly. "I know what this alliance means for your people. I understand the pressure you're under." Her expression softened slightly. "Do you?" "I think so," Thomas replied. "And that's what makes this so difficult. I want to respect your culture, your obligations, but I also see what it's doing to you. And I hate that you have to choose between what's expected and what you want." Lonnie stepped closer, her voice quiet. "What I want may not matter." "It should matter," Thomas said, his tone firm. "You should have the right to choose your own path." She looked away, her shoulders stiffening. "I do not know if that is possible." Thomas reached out, gently placing a hand on her arm. "If it's not, then let's find another way." She turned back to him, her violet eyes searching his face. "And what would that way be, Thomas?" He hesitated, his hand still on her arm. "I don't know yet. But maybe if we stand together, we can figure it out." Her expression softened further, and for a moment, the weight of her responsibilities seemed to lift. "You are different. You see things not as they are, but as they could be." "Maybe," he said with a faint smile. "But I'm not giving up. Not on you." Lonnie said nothing, but the faintest trace of a smile appeared on her lips. It was brief, barely there, but it was enough. Enough to give Thomas a glimmer of hope that perhaps there was a path forward, one that didn't require either of them to sacrifice what mattered most. Chapter 7, A Light in the Shadows. The distant hum of the station's generators reverberated through the quieter corridors. Thomas paced the length of the chamber where he and Graydon had been holed up, thinking over their next move. The pressure was mounting. The negotiations had stalled again, and worse, whispers had started circulating among the station's traders and officials. There were murmurs of dissent within the Lurwan ranks, rumors that certain factions opposed the marriage alliance and the trade agreements tied to it. "You're going to wear a groove in the floor," Graydon said, lounging in one of the worn chairs that lined the room. He leaned back, his boots propped up on a nearby table, a datapad balanced on his knee. "What's on your mind this time?" "Everything," Thomas said without stopping his pacing. The delegation's growing more divided. Lonnie's caught in the middle, and we're not making any headway on the trade deal. Graydon gave a nonchalant shrug. "Sounds like a typical day in galactic diplomacy to me." Thomas shot him a look. "It's more than that. This isn't just about policy. People's lives are affected by these decisions." "People's lives are always affected, Thomas. That's the nature of the game. But I get the sense you're more worried about one particular person." Thomas stopped mid-step and glared at him. "I don't have time for your jokes." "I'm not joking," Graydon said, setting the datapad aside and sitting up. "You care about her. And you're worried that if this alliance goes through, it'll hurt her more than anyone." Thomas opened his mouth to argue, but the words didn't come. Instead, he let out a long sigh and sat down heavily in the chair opposite Graydon. "It's not just her. It's what she represents. She's not just some figurehead, they all look to her. If she gets crushed under the weight of the steel, what message does that send?" Graydon nodded, for once looking serious. "Fair point. But what can you do about it? You're just a diplomat from Earth. You're not in a position to change their traditions." Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Maybe not. But I can help her find another way." "Another way?" "I don't know yet," Thomas admitted. "But I know she's not alone in feeling trapped by this arrangement. If we can rally the voices who want change, show them there's a different path, maybe we can break the cycle." Graydon gave him a skeptical look. "Rallying voices sounds noble, but it's risky. You know that, right? You'll be stepping on a lot of toes." "I know," Thomas said quietly. "But if I don't, who will?" Graydon studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right, let's say you're right. Let's say there's a chance to pull this off. Where do we start?" Before Thomas could answer, the door slid open and Lonnie stepped inside. She looked more tired than usual, but her posture remained straight, her gaze steady. "You will not need to start alone," she said. Thomas stood, surprised. "You heard." "I have heard much," she said, stepping closer. "And I have decided that I can no longer remain silent. The current path is untenable." "Lonnie," Graydon began, but she held up a hand. "Please," she said. "This is not a decision I have made lightly. But I can no longer ignore the cost to my people, to myself. I have spoken with others who feel the same. They are few, but they exist. If we move carefully, we can create a coalition that is strong enough to challenge the old ways." Graydon leaned back, folding his arms. "You realize this puts you at great risk." "I do," Lonnie said. "But if I do nothing, I am already lost." Thomas stepped closer, his voice firm. "Then we'll do this together. We'll find those who support change and bring them to the table. You won't be alone." Lonnie met his gaze, her expression softening. "Thank you, Thomas. I would not attempt this without your counsel." Graydon sighed and stood, clapping his hands once. "Well, looks like we're in it now. What's the plan?" "We start small," Thomas said. "We find the allies Lonnie mentioned, listen to their concerns, and give them a platform. We can't force this, we have to show them that change is possible and necessary." "And then?" Graydon asked. "Then we let the idea grow," Thomas replied. "One voice becomes two, then three. Before long, we'll have enough support to push back against the old guard." Lonnie nodded. "A delicate approach will be necessary. But if we succeed, the future will be brighter for all." Thomas smiled faintly. "One step at a time, then." Graydon shook his head, muttering under his breath, "You two are going to get me killed." But his grin betrayed a spark of admiration. "All right, let's do this." Together, they began laying the groundwork for the coalition, each of them bringing their unique strengths to the task. It was a daunting challenge, but as the hours stretched into days, they found more and more allies willing to listen, willing to consider a different path. It was just the beginning, but it was enough to start turning the tide. Chapter 8, Redefining Destiny. The large hall was nearly silent, the sound of distant machinery the only background noise. Thomas stood off to the side, watching Lonnie as she faced the small but growing group of supporters who had gathered. Her voice was steady, carrying a clarity that demanded attention. My people have followed the same traditions for generations, she said. We have relied on alliances formed by obligation, not by choice. We have sacrificed too much in the name of stability. But it is time to ask if this is truly the only path forward. Graydon leaned toward Thomas, his voice low. She's got them listening. That's a good start. Thomas nodded. We've come this far. Let's see if we can go a little further. Lonnie continued, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. I do not seek to destroy what we have built, but to strengthen it by giving our people the freedom to choose their own futures. This is not a rebellion. It is a call to reconsider what is possible. A tall, older Lurwan in the back spoke up. And what of the trade alliance? If you oppose the marriage, how will we ensure cooperation with Earth? Thomas stepped forward before Lonnie could answer. With respect, that's not the only way to secure cooperation. The Earth Federation has no interest in forcing a union that brings harm or resentment. We believe in partnerships built on mutual respect and shared goals, not coercion. There are other ways to achieve the same ends. The murmurs that followed were thoughtful, not hostile. Lonnie nodded to him, her gratitude evident. As Thomas says, we can find a new path, one where our alliances are stronger because they are chosen, not imposed. Another Lurwan, this one younger and dressed in practical work garb, raised a hand. What will stop the Warlord's faction from retaliating? If they see this as a threat to their power, won't they strike back? Graydon stepped forward this time. That's a fair concern. But from what I've seen, a lot of folks in the Warlord's faction aren't thrilled with the current arrangement either. If we present a united front, show them that change can benefit everyone, they might reconsider picking a fight. Lonnie's voice remained steady. This is not about creating enemies. It is about showing that there is another way. If we stand together, we may convince even the most skeptical among us that change is not something to fear. The crowd's energy shifted, the initial skepticism giving way to cautious optimism. A few of the delegates exchanged nods and one stepped forward. If what you say is true, then we should try. The old ways are burdensome. If there is another path, we should explore it. Lonnie inclined her head, a faint smile gracing her lips. Thank you. Your trust is not misplaced. As the crowd began to disperse, talking quietly among themselves, Graydon let out a long breath. That went better than I thought it would. It's a start, Thomas said. But we'll need more than words to solidify this. Lonnie stepped over to them, her voice soft. The fact that they were willing to listen is already a significant step. Graydon smirked. Yeah, well, let's not start celebrating just yet. There's still a long road ahead. Thomas nodded, but he felt a quiet satisfaction. A long road, sure. But at least we've taken the first step. Lonnie's gaze met his, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a shared determination. Whatever came next, they would face it together.